excellent job helping our special ed kids meet their full potential. The problem is that neither the federal government or the state government have ever provided the funding for the extra services that are mandated for our schools to give the kids. So back in the 70s, the federal government promised to pay 40% of the extra services and extra costs to educate our special ed kids. They have gotten as high as 24% over the last 2 years because of one-time stimulus dollars. But those are going away now, and it's going back to where it's always been, right around 15%. And then our state kicks in some, but not nearly as much. I mean, here's a representation of that. This is the gap between what it costs to provide the special education services that are required by law and what our schools get to fund those. And as you can see, you get that in 2007 legislation, they put money into special ed, so that dropped. And then the one-time dollars, federal stimulus dollars, made it drop. But you can see those costs are escalating at an alarming rate. And in fact, what you see in this first part, going up, the slope that goes like this, is when there was no growth factor included in legislation. Right now, up until now, over the last few years, what they do is there's one inflation factor in our education funding system, and that is called a 4.6% growth factor for special education. Understanding that special education costs on average go up 8% a year, there's an automatic inflator that puts just a special education up 4.6% to try to offset some of those costs of special ed. They are proposing to strip that out in this session, so we'll see what happens. But what that does is it helps the growth slow down. And this is the problem with special ed, is that the growth is going so fast that it is consuming more and more of our general education budget.
Before you leave that graphic, just so everyone's aware, this is for the publics, not for you, the bottom line is where funding ought to be, and this is the amount that's varied from the funding, the amount that those should almost be negative numbers.
Right. Well, yes, exactly. It's right now across the state of Minnesota, we take $742 million. Again, not a little number, big number, to fund the special education services that we don't get the funding for. So, on average, there's about 1 million pupil units in the state, so that can be easily divided. And so what we're doing is we're taking $742 per kid. Shifting to handle those services. We really need the government to step up and take on that funding so we don't pit our special ed kids against general education kids.
So again, not to go back, the previous slide indicated about 1 million kids went into the schools that previously weren't in. That 1 million was for the state or the...
It was at the national level. And of course that was 75 numbers. I don't know how many kids we have now.
Sure, okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what are schools doing? Well, they're turning to voter-approved referendum. The problem, well, as we know, is referendum is paid by local property taxes. And I have two big problems with this. First of all is the cost to the taxpayer per levy dollars varies greatly because how much we pay to levy is based on the property wealth of our district, not the property wealth of the state. So if you don't have a Mall of America or a Medtronics, or you don't have...
electronic plan.
Yeah, oh yeah, that's a good one. If you don't have that, then the cost for that referendum dollar falls directly on the taxpayer. The other problem I really have with it is under pressure from districts who can easily pass referendum. The legislature in 2005 raised the maximum level allowed of referendum dollars. Remember, the state is charged with a general and uniform system of public schools, and if they are allowing great excesses from referendum for one district versus another district, we no longer have uniformity. So what they've done is now you can get 26% of your basic formula in referendum. That's what you're legally allowed to. If you remember, in the olden days, they didn't call them operating referendums, they called them excess referendum. Referendum was never meant to provide the basics. The state was intended to provide the basics. But what has happened is, with that declining state revenue, that's how we're funding our schools. In fact, just last year, we now get $1 billion of funding through referendum. But the problem is it doesn't go equally to all kids like it did before with the general ed levy. We know we got we got districts with $1,800 worth of referendum and we got districts with zero. This is a graphic I throw on as many legislators' desks as I can, and I ask them, does this make you mad? Because it should. This is what it costs for that referendum. Now, the legal cap to referendum right now is about $1,500 per pupil. So this is the cost to get that legal referendum, $1,500. Now here in Painesville, I think you guys are at $400 roughly. $460, and in Eden Valley, you're at $700. I'm sure the school board members will be glad to know you can go out and double those or triple those next fall. But that
Up to 1,500.
right. Yep.
There are districts in the western part of the state that are more than 1,500.
Yes.
So you're not comparing apples to apples.
Well, that is because there are
fewer kids?
No, there are 6 school districts that are above that, because when they did the I think it was the 1970s Minnesota Miracle, but there was some point where they are above the cap and they were grandfathered in above the cap.
They're way above. I mean, like 2,500.
Oh yeah, and there's some of those really small towns.
Yep.
Yeah.
Chicago, Alberta.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry about all the questions. I'm not quite understanding this. We're at 450 now, so I don't understand this slide.
Let me explain it to you then. Okay, this is just a comparison at the same amount. This is what it would cost your local taxpayers per year for a $1,500 referendum. Yeah, pay the taxpayers. So, for example, if you were running a referendum campaign and you would maybe talk about some of the things that I talked about, inadequate state funding, you would go out in your community and you might go up to a senior citizen on a fixed income that lives in a $100,000 home, or you might go up to a family of 4 that could be struggling in a $100,000 home, and you would say, we really need some additional revenue. We are running a referendum. Could you please vote yes? Well, if you went to that senior citizen or that family of 4 in Orono, you would be asking them to pay $106 a year. But if you went to that same senior family here in Painesville, they would have to pay $365 a year. It's almost 3 times as much for the same referendum. And what happens is that it's not that our schools don't support referendum. Over 92% of the districts in Minnesota support referendum. But due to this, in our districts, C districts, and your districts, the board and the administration can't ask for what they need and what they want to provide for their children. They end up asking for what they think the community can bear. And we have districts with $1,800 and $2,000 in referendum, and we get that disparity that's based merely on a child's zip code and not on their needs.
Okay. So, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
So in essence, in Painesville, we're at $450. Let's say we're a third of what we could be at.
Right.
Okay. So in essence, in Painesville, we're paying on a $100,000 assessed home a third of $365.
I have exactly what you're paying, yeah. I write this down just to kind of figure it out. You guys are paying $87 for 416.
So you get 87, say it again.
$87 per $100,000 home value
Yeah.
for your 416. I know in Eden Valley, they're the closest. They have a $700 referendum. They're paying $147 for it. Hopkins has a $1,600 per pupil referendum. They're paying $4 less.
$4 less than.
So, yeah.
1,600.
They got $1,600. They're paying $143 a year for that $100,000 per $100,000. And Eden Valley is paying $147 for their $700. I'll show you a little bit more about this, and it'll become more clear. Okay, so what C has been about is equalization, equity. We want a fair chance for our districts to go ahead and be able to, if the state isn't going to fund our schools, to have a fair shot at funding our schools with some referendum dollars. A little background. Back in the mid-'80s, the situation in education was that the state was not adequately funding our schools. We had quite a bit of money in referendum, and it was based on the district's will, and the maximum allowable amount was 30% of the basic formula. Does that sound like a deja vu moment? Here we are again. But back in that time, then C, Schools for Equity, started a lawsuit. It was called Skeen versus the state of Minnesota. And it was a lawsuit based on equity, that there was not a fair chance to access dollars. We did not have a uniform system of schools. And that grew into a pretty large effort, and that case was successful in Minnesota district courts. And the state immediately appealed, and it was a 2-year appeal process, and during that time the legislature met. And they went, shoot, we lost in the lower courts. We could lose again in the Supreme Court. We better do something to help our chances. So they did 3 things. They ended up rolling a lot of those categorical spending into the basic formula, which gave everybody a little bit more money. They decreased the maximum allowable referendum from 30% down to 18%, and they initiated the program called Equalization. And what is equalization? It's tax relief for local taxpayers. It's a match of state aid to make those referendums more affordable in lower property wealth districts. And the percent of what our local taxpayers pay versus what the state will kick in, the percent that our local taxpayer pays, the percent levy, is calculated this way. You take all the market value in your district per student and you multiply it by $476,000. The problem is that $476,000 should never have been, in this formula, a fixed number. Back in 1993, when they set this up, it was 2.5 times the average market value. So that kind of made it fair. And I'll show you. Well, in fact, the best way of showing you is to talk through this slide. This is for Paynesville. Back in 1995, when the equalization kicked in, for every dollar referendum that you passed in Paynesville, the state would pay 79 cents, and your local taxpayers would be responsible for the other 21 cents. Now, this was not a gift to you here in Paynesville, so you could pay way less. This is what was required, so that on that previous chart, it would be 106, 106, 106, 106, all the way down. Everybody would be paying the same amount. Well, as you can see, as property values went up, because we haven't adjusted that denominator, it should have been like 2.5 times the state average instead of that fixed number. You can see that the ratio, what your taxpayers are responsible for and what the state is responsible for, has inverted. So now for every dollar referendum you pass here in Paynesville, your taxpayers are responsible for 77 cents of it, and the state's responsible for 23 cents. That is why you are now paying 3 times as much for the same referendum dollar as people who have higher values, property values. There's a couple things about this. Besides the fact that we're paying 3 times as much, it adds a lot of confusion in your community. Every November, people get their truth in taxation property tax notices, and they rip them open and they look at it, and they go, geez, my tax has gone up, nobody likes that. And they look at that school levy line and they see it's gone up, and they don't understand why. They're saying, we didn't pass a referendum this year, we passed it 3 years ago. And the schools say they're getting no more money, but they're getting it from me. I can see it right here in my tax notice. Well, this is what is happening. The state is paying less and they're paying more. Actually, the state got a break. Our schools are getting the same amount of money, and our communities are not understanding what is going on, and there's a lot of confusion, and it can lead to distrust. So it's not a very good thing. I threw in Eden Valley. It's in your thing if you wanted to, but you guys are essentially the same on property wealth and all that. So it all adds up. The basic formula has not kept up with inflation. Schools are burdened with additional yet unfunded mandates. The reliance on the unequalized voter-approved referendum for the very basics of education, I feel, has created a system in Minnesota of a have and have-not system of public schools, and certainly not uniform. So the quality public education, and you hear this down at the Capitol all the time, education is the engine that drives Minnesota's economic prosperity. And that engine is that whole system is threatened by years of neglect at the state level. Oh, I got that in there twice. Okay, where are we today? Like what we do at C is we obviously are down at the legislature. We are bringing the concerns of our districts down to the state, and we lobby on their behalf. And what has happened is, if you haven't heard, Minnesota has a deficit. Probably most everybody knows that. Last session, they had a $3 billion deficit. And they solved that 2/3 of that deficit by going to the schools. What they did is they shifted aid payments to our schools. Before then, the state